The drawing-room at Windermere House wore its transformation with the resigned dignity of a dowager duchess pressed into amateur theatricals. Persian carpets had been rolled aside, Chippendale chairs arranged in precise rows, and the Steinway draped with sheet music like ceremonial bunting. Through the tall windows, December dusk pressed against the glass with that particular intensity of approaching snow, turning the panes into mirrors that reflected the room's warm lamplight back upon itself. Lady Constance Windermere surveyed her assembled company with the practised eye of one who had spent 30 years orchestrating charitable endeavours for the betterment of society and the entertainment of her peers. This evening's final rehearsal of scenes from Rie, The Merchant of Venice, represented her latest campaign against what she privately termed the regrettable coarsening of modern culture. If the drawing-rooms of England could not preserve the finer sensibilities, she reasoned, where else might they find sanctuary? "I do hope," she murmured to her nephew, Captain Jeremy Thornton, who stood at military attention beside the fireplace, "that we shall manage to elevate Shakespeare above the rather unfortunate interpretations one encounters in London these days. Theatre should edify, should it not, rather than merely titillate." The captain, whose recent return from a tedious posting in India had left him with the restless air of a man seeking purpose in peacetime, offered a precise nod. His gaze, however, drifted across the room to where Miss Eleanor Vance was arranging her script with movements of studied grace. At 32, she possessed that rare quality of beauty refined by intelligence and experience, her reputation as an actress of the serious stage lending gravitas to Lady Constance's amateur production. "The trial scene," announced Dr. Pemberton Hale from his position near the piano, "requires particular delicacy. Shylock's motivations must be understood, not merely portrayed." The distinguished physician had surprised everyone with the psychological complexity of his interpretation, bringing to the role an intensity that seemed almost unseemly in a drawing-room performance. Miss Vance looked up from her script, her dark eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been amusement or assessment. Understanding and portrayal, Dr. Hale, are perhaps more intimately connected than we might suppose. One cannot truly convey what one has not first comprehended. The observation hung in the air with the weight of unspoken meaning. Mr. Giles Ashworth, whose Bassanio had been deemed adequately romantic by Lady Constance, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. At 28, he possessed the sort of conventional handsomeness that recommended him to hostesses seeking to balance their dinner parties, though his theatrical ambitions exceeded his natural gifts. "Quite so," he said, with a brightness that suggested effort. "The depths of character, the subtle currents beneath the surface. Surely these are what distinguish true art from mere entertainment." Mr. Julian Carstairs, who had arrived from London the previous month ostensibly to research Elizabethan staging techniques, observed this exchange with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal customs. His presence had caused considerable speculation among the neighbourhood's social arbiters, for his credentials were impeccable, yet somehow incomplete, like a portrait painted with masterful technique but lacking a signature. "The Echo Room," Lady Constance announced, consulting her notes, "will serve admirably for the final scene. The acoustics, I'm told, are quite remarkable, a peculiarity of the Tudor construction that my late husband's grandfather discovered quite by accident during renovations." Mrs. Dorothea Whitmore, the vicar's wife pressed into service as director, fluttered her hands with nervous enthusiasm. How perfectly atmospheric! Shakespeare himself could hardly have devised a more suitable setting for Portia's final revelations. Trevithick, the butler whose discretion was so profound it seemed almost metaphysical, moved silently to adjust the lamps. His presence was felt rather than observed, a quality that had made him invaluable to 3 generations of Windermeres. He alone seemed to notice the way Miss Vance's fingers worried the edge of her script, or how Captain Thornton's military bearing faltered slightly whenever she spoke. "Shall we begin?" Lady Constance inquired, settling into her chair with the satisfaction of one who has successfully orchestrated another cultural elevation. "From Portia's entrance, I believe. The quality of mercy speech requires our most careful attention." As the players took their positions, the room's atmosphere seemed to shift imperceptibly. The lamplight, which had seemed warm and welcoming, now cast shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. The approaching storm pressed more insistently against the windows, and the fire in the grate settled with a soft sigh that might have been contentment or resignation. Miss Vance rose. her silk gown catching the light as she moved to centre stage. For a moment she stood perfectly still, and in that stillness something crystallised, a sense that the evening's performance might prove more revelatory than anyone had anticipated. "The quality of mercy," she began, "is not strained." But even as the immortal words filled the room, the assembled company seemed aware that other, less visible dramas were playing out simultaneously, their scripts written not by Shakespeare, but by the far more dangerous hand of human passion. The rehearsal commenced, each line delivered with careful precision, yet somehow the very perfection of the performance suggested that beneath the civilized surface of their gathering, currents of tension moved like underground streams, waiting for the proper moment to breach the careful levees of social convention. The migration to the Echo Room proceeded with the measured formality of a religious procession. Lady Constance led the way through corridors that seemed to narrow with the approaching storm, past portraits whose eyes appeared to follow their passage with ancestral disapproval. The Echo Room itself revealed its peculiar character immediately. Octagonal walls of honey-coloured stone that curved upward to a vaulted ceiling, creating an acoustic phenomenon that had mystified visitors for 3 centuries. "Quite remarkable," murmured Mr. Carstairs, positioning himself near the narrow windows where December pressed against leaded glass with increasing urgency. "The medieval builders understood something about sound that we have perhaps forgotten." Miss Vance took her place at the room's focal point, where the acoustic properties converged most dramatically. When she spoke, her voice seemed to emanate from multiple sources simultaneously, creating an effect both ethereal and unsettling. "The quality of mercy is not strained," she began, and the words returned to them subtly transformed, as if the room itself were offering commentary. Dr. Hale, still bearing the psychological weight of his Shylock, moved restlessly near the ancient stone archway. His interpretation had surprised everyone with its psychological complexity, revealing depth that seemed almost unseemly in an amateur production. Captain Thornton observed him with the systematic attention of a military mind, noting the physician's pallor and the slight tremor in his hands as he consulted his script. "The trial scene requires particular delicacy," Dr. Hale had said earlier, and now, watching him pace within the confines of the Echo Room, one wondered if he had perhaps invested too much of himself in understanding Shylock's motivations. The rehearsal proceeded with mechanical precision, each line delivered with that careful reverence society accords to masterpieces as taken into custody. Yet beneath the civilized surface, currents of tension moved like underground streams. Mr. Ashworth's Bassanio seemed increasingly hollow beside Dr. Hale's dark intensity. Mrs. Whitmore fluttered her directorial instructions with nervous energy, while Trevithick maintained his position near the door with the silent efficiency that had made him indispensable to 3 generations of Wintermeres. Outside, the storm had begun in earnest. Rain struck the narrow windows with increasing violence, adding a percussive undertone that seemed to complement Shakespeare's themes of justice and retribution. The Echo Room's acoustics amplified these natural sounds, creating an atmosphere of mounting unease that had little to do with the evening's theatrical ambitions. "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" Dr. Hale delivered Shylock's famous speech with an intensity that transcended amateur theatricals. His voice, when it returned from the stone walls, seemed to carry additional weight, as if the room itself were endorsing his interpretation. "If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die?" The final phrase hung in the air with uncomfortable resonance. Miss Vance, preparing for Portia's response, glanced toward Dr. Hale with something that might have been concern. The physician had grown increasingly pale during the evening's performance, his movements acquiring a peculiar deliberation that suggested either deep concentration or physical distress. "Dr. Hale," Lady Constance inquired with the gentle authority of a hostess sensitive to her guests' well-being, "perhaps we might pause for refreshment? The evening has been rather demanding." He waved away her concern with a gesture that was meant to be dismissive but appeared instead almost desperate. "The scene must be completed," he insisted, his voice carrying that useful authority doctors possess even in drawing rooms. "The psychological arc requires resolution." They continued, but something had shifted imperceptibly. The Echo Room, which had seemed merely atmospheric moments before, now felt oppressive, its acoustic properties transforming their voices into whispers that seemed to mock their civilized pretensions. Dr. Hale delivered his final lines with mechanical precision, then moved toward the narrow window where winter pressed against the glass with increasing urgency. The rehearsal concluded with polite applause that seemed to die too quickly in the stone chamber. As the others began to gather their scripts and prepare for departure, Dr. Hale remained motionless by the window, his back to the room, gazing out into the storm-darkened landscape. "Doctor?" Captain Thornton inquired, his military instincts alert to something amiss in his companion's posture. There was no response. Dr. Hale stood with a peculiar rigidity, as if carved from the same stone as the room's ancient walls. Trevithick, whose training extended to the recognition of crisis in all its forms, approached with silent efficiency. "Sir," he murmured, reaching out to touch the physician's shoulder with the careful courtesy that characterized all his interactions. Dr. Hale swayed slightly, then collapsed with terrible silent grace. He fell, not with the violence of sudden death, but with the resigned dignity of one who has finally succumbed to forces beyond his control. There was no struggle, no cry of alarm, no disruption of the evening's careful orchestration, merely the quiet cessation of breath in a room designed to amplify every whisper. Trevithick knelt beside the fallen figure with movements that betrayed no alarm, his face maintaining the perfect neutrality that had served the Wintermere family for decades. He felt for a pulse that was no longer there, noted the unnatural stillness that had replaced the physician's earlier agitation, and rose with the measured dignity that crisis demanded. "Lady Constance," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustic chamber, "I fear we must send for the authorities." The words seemed to expand in the echo room's peculiar atmosphere, returning to them with subtle alterations that made the simple statement sound like a prophecy. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the ancient stones, but inside a different kind of tempest had begun, one that would require more than architectural ingenuity to resolve. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Wintermere House with the storm, though one would hardly have noticed his entrance had it not been for Trevithick's subtle shift in posture as he opened the door. The inspector possessed that rare quality of commanding attention without demanding it, his presence settling over the assembled company like fine dust, barely perceptible yet somehow altering the very atmosphere of the room. He was neither tall nor imposing in the theatrical sense, yet something in his manner suggested depth that amateur dramatics could not easily fathom. "Lady Constance," he said, accepting her greeting with a bow that managed to be both respectful and professionally detached. "I understand there has been an unfortunate incident during your rehearsal." His voice carried the cultured tones of one equally comfortable in Scotland Yard and the drawing rooms of Mayfair, and the request for information was made with such gentle courtesy that it seemed almost conversational. Yet each member of the company felt the weight of professional scrutiny settling upon them with the inevitability of dusk. Lady Constance described the evening's events with admirable composure, though her pearls trembled slightly at her throat, confessing what her voice would not. Miss Vance arranged herself in a chair with movements that suggested both grace and careful consideration, while Captain Thornton maintained his military bearing despite something indefinable having shifted in his posture since the inspector's arrival. "The echo room," Alleyn mused, as if tasting the phrase. "How fascinating! Perhaps you might show me where it happened, and someone should telephone for the local surgeon. Sergeant Fox will be arriving shortly." They proceeded through corridors where ancestral portraits seemed to lift painted eyebrows at this turn of events. The echo room received them with that subtle malice it bestows upon careless remarks at house parties. It repeated, with variations. The octagonal chamber of honey-coloured stone enveloped sound and returned it, a fraction altered, and the air was perceptibly cooler than the drawing-room's cultivated warmth. Dr. Pemberton Hale lay near the narrow window, his profile turned toward the storm-darkened landscape beyond the leaded panes. The attitude held no melodrama. He might at a glance have been resting at a moment of contemplation, listening to the rain. Alleyn approached with that economy of movement which in another man might have seemed theatrical, kneeling beside the figure with unhurried grace. He performed the same examination Trevithick had done, knowing already what he would not find. The skin showed that subtle withdrawal from the surface, as if thinking of the skull beneath. The hands lay palm down, relaxed, no scratch marks at the wrists, no clenched nails. A faint dampness along the upper lip caught his attention, and in the air lingered a scent that resisted immediate description. Not almonds, thank God. Not that ridiculous caricature of detective fiction. Something cleaner, more elusive. "Has anyone touched the window?" he inquired without looking around. "No, sir," Trevithick replied with his customary precision. "It was shut when we found him thus." The latch gleamed with moisture. On the sill a small smear marked the stone, a half-moon the size of a thumbprint dull against the weathered surface. Alleyn leaned closer, allowing his breath to cloud the glass. On the inner surface, someone's hand had rested briefly, leaving the suggestion of 4 prints and the arc of a thumb facing inward, as they must. Near Dr. Hale, a script lay open, the page bruised where a fountain pen had blotted. "If you poison us, do we not die?" The question had accepted in ink its own answer. The pen itself, silver uncapped, rested crosswise upon the stone, a darker spot staining the nib. "The lighting was as you see it now?" Alleyn asked, surveying the modest arrangements. The makeshift bench contrived from an oak chest, a pair of brass scales set upon it with mathematical precision, the scattered scripts where people had laid them down in their haste. "2 lamps only," Lady Constance confirmed. "We found the atmosphere otherwise too theatrical." Sergeant Fox arrived with the constable, his large, mild presence somehow managing not to disturb the room's acoustic properties. He looked at Dr. Hale, then at Alleyn, and even in this peculiar space his silence returned unaltered. At Alleyn's quiet direction, he began the careful work of evidence collection, photographing, bagging, labelling, with gloved hands and unhappy nods, as if scent and smears were personal affronts to his orderly nature. "Miss Vance," Alleyn said, noting how she had remained at the threshold where sound would travel to her most clearly, "you were speaking when Dr. Hale moved to the window?" She seemed momentarily not to register his address, then inclined her head with that measured consideration that had distinguished her professional performances. "He said he wanted completion," she answered, her voice lying flat upon the stone and returning with ghostly emphasis. "He went to the window and said nothing further that I heard." Alleyn observed that she had removed a glove and crushed it, perhaps without noting in her other hand. The bare fingers looked startled, stripped of their rightful coverings, a detail that spoke to nerves beneath the cultivated surface. "We shall talk presently, all of us," he announced, rising with fluid grace. "For now, if you will, return to the drawing-room. No one far from the house, I think. The storm provides excellent justification for that request." As the company withdrew with practised civility, Alleyn remained with Fox and the constable. He stood for a moment exactly where Miss Vance had delivered Mercy's quality, drew breath, and let a single syllable fall into the space. "Ah!" It skittered around the octagon, converted to whispers behind him. Fox, hearing it as conversation near his ear, turned reflexively, and Alleyn's mouth made an apologetic shape. "The phenomenon is remarkable," he murmured to his sergeant. "One stands and whispers, and the room tells someone else. It may have told someone something they meant for themselves alone." The echo room held its secrets with the patience of centuries, but Alleyn had begun the delicate work of coaxing them into the light. The drawing-room had resumed its customary dignity, though the hastily abandoned theatrical arrangements lent it an air of interrupted ceremony. Trevithick had restored the Persian carpets and adjusted the lamps with that intuitive understanding of crisis that distinguished superior servants, creating an atmosphere of cultivated calm that might encourage confidences while discouraging dramatics. The storm continued its assault on the tall windows, providing a percussion that seemed to underscore the evening's mounting tensions. Inspector Alleyn settled into the chair Lady Constance indicated with the grace of one accepting an invitation to tea, rather than conducting interviews in a case of sudden death. His manner suggested that the questioning to follow would be conducted with the same courtesy one might extend to discussing the weather. Yet something in his quiet attention made each member of the company acutely aware that their responses would be weighed with professional precision. The interviews begin. "Lady Constance," he began, his tone carrying that particular blend of deference and authority that marked his approach, "you mentioned that Dr. Hale brought a certain seriousness to your production. Had you known him long?" Lady Constance arranged herself with the composed dignity that had sustained her through decades of charitable committees and social crises. Her pearls, however, betrayed a slight tremor at her throat. "Not long at all, Inspector. He came as Mrs. Whitmore's guest in October. A restorative weekend, she called it. We discovered our mutual enthusiasm for Shakespeare, and when the notion of these rehearsals arose, his participation seemed providential. He appeared to invest considerable energy in his portrayal of Shylock. Indeed, One might say he brought a psychological intensity that was perhaps excessive for amateur theatricals, but then Pemberton had very strong convictions about the nature of justice. He felt Shakespeare had explored the theme with unparalleled depth. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the fire. The echo room seemed to amplify not merely his voice, but his fervour. Alleyn noted the careful choice of words. The room itself, has it always been used for theatrical purposes? Oh no! My late husband's grandfather discovered its acoustic properties quite by accident during renovations. It was originally a chapel, I believe, converted to secular use in the 18th century. The window where poor Pemberton was found overlooks what was once the herb garden, though it's been neglected for years. The detail settled into Alleyn's mind with quiet significance. Herb gardens in houses of this vintage had often served purposes beyond mere culinary convenience. Captain Jeremy Thornton entered the conversation with military precision, his bearing intact despite the evening's disruption. Alleyn observed that the captain's composure, while admirable, seemed to require conscious effort, a slight rigidity about the shoulders that suggested tension carefully controlled. "Captain, you were quick to respond when Dr. Hale collapsed. Had you noticed anything unusual about his condition during the rehearsal?" "He seemed wound up," Thornton replied with characteristic economy. "One can tell after service. Men under pressure have a particular quality to their movements. Dr. Hale had been displaying it increasingly over recent weeks. You had occasion to observe him frequently?" "We belonged to the same club, shared an interest in the theatre." The answer came with military efficiency, yet Alleyn noted how the captain's gaze had drifted almost imperceptibly toward Miss Vance during his response. "Did you like him, Captain?" A moment's hesitation. "I respected his intellect. I was less comfortable with the manner in which he employed it. He had a way of treating human feeling as a medical condition to be diagnosed." The observation hung in the air with uncomfortable precision. Alleyn allowed it to settle before continuing. "You noticed, I believe, that he took something during Miss Vance's speech?" "A lozenge of some sort. He'd done so earlier as well. I assumed a throat complaint." Mr. Giles Ashworth succeeded the captain with movements that betrayed nervous energy beneath a veneer of casual elegance. His conventional handsomeness appeared somehow diminished in the firelight, and Alleyn noted immediately the bluish crescent near the thumb of his right hand, the telltale mark of fountain pen ink. "Mr. Ashworth, you bear an ink stain," Alleyn observed with the same casual interest he might have shown in commenting on the weather. Ashworth glanced at his hand with apparent surprise. "Do I? Beastly scripts. They blot frightfully. One can never trust theatrical ink." "You were consulting with Dr. Hale on medical matters, I understand." The young man's composure flickered slightly. "Nothing serious, Inspector. Merely the sort of consultation one seeks from a trusted physician. Matters of general health." The qualification carried more weight than its casual delivery suggested. Alleyn noted that Ashworth's hands, steady during the theatrical performance, now betrayed a slight tremor as he reached for his brandy glass. These consultations, were they of a nature that might have caused Dr. Hale professional concern? The question produced a silence that seemed to expand beyond its natural boundaries. Mrs. Whitmore, whose directorial enthusiasm had seemed so genuine earlier, fluttered her hands with renewed nervousness. "Surely, Inspector, such matters would be confidential between physician and patient." "Indeed," Alleyn agreed with a smile that managed to be both understanding and implacable, "though death sometimes alters the boundaries of discretion. The professional assessment." Miss Eleanor Vance entered without being summoned, a precise contravention that looked, in her case, like obedience to some higher theatrical law. She arranged herself with the unconscious precision of one trained to command attention on stage, though her movements held a restraint that suggested careful consideration of each gesture. "May I save you the preliminary courtesies, Inspector?" she asked quietly. "You wish to know whether Dr. Hale frightened me. He did not. He unsettled me. Those are quite different things." Alleyn found himself genuinely interested. "In what way?" "He auditioned truth, Inspector. He watched for it in others with the intensity of a physician examining symptoms. It made one feel less like a performer than a specimen under observation." She paused, her dark eyes holding that assessment he had noted earlier. There was something desperate in his recent behaviour, as if the role of Shylock had become more than mere acting. You were speaking when he moved to the window. Did you complete your speech?" We all continued because that is what one does in such circumstances. It's a discipline that serves one often and fails one sometimes. Tonight, it failed us. Alleyn noted that she wore only one glove. The other had vanished entirely. The bare hand lay perfectly composed in her lap, yet its nakedness seemed somehow significant, like a small confession of distress beneath the cultivated surface. Academic observations. Mr. Julian Carstairs presented himself with the mild expression of scholarly interest that had characterized his presence throughout the evening. He carried a small leather-bound notebook, which he consulted with the casual precision of an academic accustomed to recording observations. "The Echo Room," he began without preamble, "possesses remarkable acoustic properties. One could communicate across the space with extraordinary clarity, provided one understood its particular characteristics. You tested these properties this evening?" "Earlier, yes. Mr. Ashworth showed some interest. He applauds anything novel." Miss Vance tried it briefly, but seemed to find the experience disagreeable. Carstairs adjusted his spectacles with scholarly precision. "Dr. Hale observed our experiments with what one might call professional interest." "Professional?" "He mentioned having researched certain historical practices, medieval and Renaissance approaches to, shall we say, discreet communication. For authenticity in his betrayal, he claimed, though his interest seemed to extend beyond mere theatrical accuracy." The observation fell into the room like a stone into still water. Alleyn allowed the implications to settle before continuing. Did his research yield any particular insights? He seemed particularly fascinated by substances that might be absorbed through the skin or respiratory system. Medieval practitioners, he said, possessed remarkable sophistication in such matters. The servant's perspective. Trevithick appeared at the conclusion of the interviews with that perfect timing that distinguished superior domestic service. His presence carried the weight of 3 generations' discretion, and Alleyn recognised in him the type of servant who possessed intimate knowledge of household currents, while maintaining absolute professional neutrality. "Mr. Trevithick, you were present throughout the rehearsal. Did you observe anything unusual in Dr. Hale's behaviour or appearance?" "The doctor seemed somewhat agitated, sir. He requested water several times during the evening, more frequently than is his custom. I maintained a carafe and glasses in the Echo Room, as is usual when the room is employed for such purposes." "As is usual?" "Yes, sir. The room's acoustics create a particular dryness that affects the throat. Dr. Hale was aware of this phenomenon." The butler's response carried layers of meaning beneath its surface courtesy. Alleyn sensed that Trevithick possessed knowledge he was not yet prepared to share, not from malice, but from that profound discretion that made such servants invaluable to their employers. Emerging patterns. As the interviews concluded, Alleyn found himself contemplating not facts, which remained frustratingly elusive, but relationships and tensions that had been carefully concealed beneath the evening's theatrical civilities. Dr. Hale had clearly occupied a position of peculiar influence among this gathering, his medical authority extending into areas that transcended mere professional consultation. The physical evidence, the ink stain on Ashworth's thumb, Miss Vance's missing glove, the fountain pen found near the body, suggested a story more complex than simple medical collapse. Yet the truth remained hidden beneath layers of social convention and personal discretion, like a manuscript written in disappearing ink. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Windermere House, with increasing violence, as if nature itself were demanding answers that civilized society was reluctant to provide. In the drawing-room the fire settled with a soft sigh, and somewhere in the house a clock made its small, exact notation of the passing hour. Alleyn rose with fluid grace, his interviews complete but his investigation far from concluded. The quality of mercy, he reflected, might indeed be unstrained, but the quality of truth appeared to be under considerable pressure, compressed by the weight of secrets that even death had not yet succeeded in releasing. The descent to the servants' quarters carried Alleyn and Sergeant Fox through a transformation as complete as any theatrical scene change. Beyond the green baize door, Windermere House contracted into its working arteries, where the storm's violence became mere distant percussion, and the air held that particular amalgam of beeswax, coal dust, and the indefinable essence of lives lived in careful service. The passage walls, lined with serviceable whitewash over medieval stone, bore the patina of centuries, and here, in these functional spaces, the house's true pulse could be felt. Trevithick's domain. The butler received them in his private sitting room with that measured courtesy that had sustained 3 generations of Wintermeres through social crises and domestic complexities. His silver hair caught the lamplight as he arranged himself with unconscious dignity, hands correctly at rest, yet something in his manner suggested that the evening's events had disturbed the careful equilibrium of his professional world. "Mr. Trevithick," Alleyn began, settling into the chair indicated with fluid grace, "your position provides you with observations that others might overlook. I suspect the evening revealed irregularities that your trained eye would notice." The butler inclined his head with that subtle acknowledgement that marked superior domestic service. Dr. Hale's behaviour was irregular, Inspector. He arrived for dinner with a peculiar intensity, declining wine and requesting only water. During the meal he seemed distracted, frequently consulting his pocket watch and making notes in a small leather book. "You observed the contents of these notes?" "Not directly, sir. However, when he departed for the drawing-room, he left the book open on the table. I observed what appeared to be botanical sketches accompanied by numerical calculations." Trevithick's pause was almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of professional discretion carefully balanced against civic duty. The revelation settled into the conversation with quiet significance. Alleyn found himself contemplating the intersection of medical knowledge, botanical research, and the theatrical performance that had concluded so tragically in the Echo Room. "The refreshments for the Echo Room, you mentioned this was your usual practice." "Indeed, sir. The room's acoustic properties create a particular dryness that affects the throat and respiratory system. I maintain a carafe and glasses as a matter of course." Trevithick's composure flickered slightly. There was, however, an irregularity this evening. The silver stopper for the carafe was mislaid. I was obliged to substitute one of crystal from the breakfast room. "When was it mislaid?" "This afternoon, after I'd polished the service. I set out the tray as usual, but the stopper was not in its customary place." The butler's admission carried the weight of professional failure, however minor. Alleyn noted the detail with quiet interest. "Who has access to the pantry where such items are kept?" "Myself, Mrs. Hartwell the housekeeper, and young Stokes the footman. However, Dr. Hale had expressed particular interest in the Echo Room's appointments during his previous visits. He mentioned that medieval architects had designed such spaces with specific purposes in mind, purposes that extended beyond mere acoustic enhancement." The housekeeper's assessment. Mrs. Hartwell appeared with the composed efficiency that had managed Wintermere's domestic complexities for 3 decades. Her grey hair was arranged with mathematical precision, and her black dress bore not a single crease despite the evening's disruptions. Yet something in her manner suggested currents of unease beneath the professional calm. "Inspector," she began before he could speak, "I must tell you that Dr. Hale was not himself this evening, not himself at all." Her assessment carried the authority of one whose ability to gauge human behaviour had been refined through years of managing house guests and their subtle fluctuations of mood and motive. He requested his usual room when he arrived yesterday, the blue room overlooking the herb garden, but this morning he asked to be moved to the east wing, said the view from his window was disturbing his rest. She paused, her hands folding with unconscious precision. "In 30 years, Inspector, I've never known a guest to request such a change without significant cause." "Did he offer explanation?" "He mentioned having researched the history of the house. Something about the herb garden's former purposes had unsettled him. The previous Lady Wintermere, the present lady's mother-in-law, maintained extensive records of the garden's historical plantings. Dr. Hale spent considerable time studying them. The connection between the Echo Room's window and the herb garden below acquired new significance in light of this revelation. Alleyn contemplated the careful positioning that would allow someone familiar with the house's layout to observe activities in the chamber from the neglected garden paths. Kitchen observations. Mary Benson, the youngest member of the domestic staff, appeared at Mrs. Hartwell's summons with nervous energy that spoke to youth's intersection with official authority. Her testimony emerged in careful fragments, each detail requiring gentle encouragement from Allayon's practised courtesy. "Dr. Hale requested fresh water for the Echo Room, sir. said the water in the drawing room tasted peculiar, though we draw from the same well for the entire house. Her brow furrowed with concentration. He thanked me most particularly and said I needn't return unless summoned. Did anyone else request refreshments during the evening? Mr. Ashworth asked for a glass during their break, sir, and I noticed Dr. Hale had a small tin, dark green with gold letters, from which he took lozenges. When he took one in the echo room, he made a face at the taste as if it were unpleasant medicine. The detail possessed that specificity that marks genuine observation. Alleyn noted how the girl's training had made her sensitive to deviations from normal guest behaviour, her account providing texture to the evening's events that the drawing-room interviews had not revealed. Physical evidence in the still-room. The still-room investigation proved particularly illuminating. Mrs. Hartwell led them to the small chamber where dried herbs were stored in labelled jars arranged with military precision. Yet Alleyn's trained eye immediately detected subtle disruptions in the perfect order, a jar of horehound set slightly out of alignment, a faint ring on the wooden table where something with a narrow base had recently stood. "Has anything been moved?" he inquired, his gaze settling on the displaced jar. "No, sir. The rosemary jar wants a pinch. I brewed some yesterday for Lady Constance's evening tea, but the horehound hasn't been touched in weeks." Near the ring on the table, Alleyn observed a tiny flake of something white, no larger than a crumb, and on the shelf the dust had been disturbed along a narrow strip as if a jar wider than the horehound container had recently occupied that space. He made no move to touch these traces, but their significance was not lost on his professional assessment. The groundskeeper's knowledge. William Hodges entered with the measured dignity of one whose authority extended over Wintermere's extensive grounds. His weathered hands bore the permanent stains of soil and seasons, and his knowledge of the estate's botanical history proved both extensive and unsettling. The herb garden was planted according to medieval principles, he confirmed in response to Alleyn's careful inquiry. The previous Lady Wintermere consulted with scholars from Cambridge on historical accuracy. The usual healing herbs, certainly, lavender, chamomile, sage, but also varieties that served other purposes, digitalis for the heart, though dangerous in quantity, aconite for pain, though deadly if misused. The groundskeeper's revelation that Dr. Hale had shown considerable interest in the garden during previous visits, collecting specimens for what he termed historical verification, added another layer to the physician's research activities. Connecting threads. As the servants' testimonies concluded, Alleyn found himself contemplating a portrait of Dr. Hale that differed significantly from the dedicated amateur actor the drawing-room company had described. The physician had apparently been conducting research that combined his medical knowledge with historical botanical practices, his activities suggesting purposes that transcended mere scholarly curiosity. The missing carafe stopper, the displaced items in the still-room, the botanical specimens and careful calculations, these details painted a picture of systematic preparation that cast the evening's tragic conclusion in an entirely different light. Yet the fountain pen found near his body, Ashworth's ink-stained thumb, Miss Vance's missing glove, these elements suggested interactions and intentions that remained tantalizingly beyond his current understanding. Sergeant Fox, who had maintained his characteristic silence throughout the interviews, looked up from his notebook with that mild expression that marked his moments of professional insight. "Quite a bit of preparation, sir, for what was supposed to be amateur theatricals." "Indeed, Fox," Alleyn replied quietly. "The question becomes whether Dr. Hale was preparing for the evening's performance, or something else entirely." The storm continued its assault on Wintermere House with undiminished violence, but in the servants' quarters a different kind of tempest had been revealed, one composed of careful observations, professional discretions, and the gradual accumulation of evidence that suggested the evening's tragedy had been neither sudden nor unpredictable. The servants had indeed known more than they initially revealed, but their knowledge was woven from the careful threads of routine disrupted, habits altered, and the subtle signs that mark the intersection of desperation with opportunity. As they prepared to return to the main house, Alleyn reflected that the truth lay somewhere between the drawing-room's cultivated civilities and the servants' hall's practical observations, hidden in that space where social convention met human need, and where the careful choreography of domestic service had recorded details that might yet prove crucial to understanding what had truly transpired in the Echo Room's acoustic embrace. The return to the Echo Room carried with it the weight of accumulated knowledge, each detail observed in the servants' quarters now casting new shadows across the chamber's honey-coloured stones. The storm had settled into that steady persistence that marks winter's deepest hours, and the acoustic properties that had seemed merely atmospheric during the evening's performance now revealed themselves as something far more purposeful in the lamplight's careful illumination. The room's hidden grammar. Inspector Alleyn moved through the octagonal space with the measured attention of one reading a familiar text in which certain words had been subtly altered. The medieval architects had indeed understood something about sound and space that transcended mere aesthetic consideration, and as he positioned himself at the chamber's focal point, he began to comprehend the full implications of their ancient knowledge. "Trevithick," he said quietly, "would you be so good as to arrange the room exactly as it was before the rehearsal commenced?" The butler complied with that ritualistic precision that had sustained 3 generations of Wintermeres through social complexities and domestic crises. Each movement spoke to established custom, the oak chest drawn forward to create a makeshift bench, the brass scales positioned with mathematical exactness, the crystal carafe placed upon its silver salver, with 2 inverted glasses flanking it like ceremonial sentinels. Yet as Alleyn observed this restoration, certain irregularities became apparent with startling clarity. The oak surface bore not 1 but 2 faint rings where vessels had habitually rested, the newer circle still bearing traces of moisture that the wood had absorbed and was reluctant to surrender. The brass scales, which belonged properly in the still room according to Mrs. Hartwell's testimony, sat with suspicious perfection upon the chest, their polished surfaces gleaming with recent attention. "The silver stopper," Trevithick murmured with that slight hesitation that marked professional distress, "has not been recovered. I must again employ the crystal substitute." Alleyn watched this substitution with growing understanding. The crystal stopper sat imperfectly in the carafe's neck, perching rather than sealing, creating a subtle but significant alteration in the room's established ritual. Here was disrupted routine made manifest, the kind of small deviation that might pass unnoticed in the moment, but would register with trained domestic sensibilities as fundamentally wrong. The Whispering Gallery's secret. Mr. Carstairs, summoned to demonstrate the chamber's acoustic properties, moved to a position 6 feet from the narrow window with the quiet enthusiasm of a scholar invited to discuss his specialty. He placed one hand against the stone wall with the familiarity of previous experimentation, and spoke in a voice scarcely louder than breath. "The medievals understood their necessities," his words reached Alleyn as clearly as if whispered directly into his ear, despite the distance between them. To confess without being overheard, or to overhear without appearing to listen. The implication settled into Alleyn's consciousness with uncomfortable precision. Someone standing in the neglected herb garden below could observe activities within the Echo Room, while remaining invisible to its occupants, the window's position, and the chamber's acoustic properties creating opportunities for surveillance that extended far beyond casual eavesdropping. "Who experimented with these properties during your afternoon explorations?" Alleyn inquired, noting how the question seemed to multiply and return from the stone walls with subtle variations. "Mr. Ashworth found it amusing," Carstairs replied with scholarly detachment. "Miss Vance participated briefly but seemed to find the experience disagreeable. Dr. Hale observed our demonstrations with considerable professional interest, making notes in that leather book he carried. The evidence of disrupted custom." Sergeant Fox, who had been conducting his methodical examination of the chamber's periphery, crouched unexpectedly near the oak chest and produced a small rectangle of card that had lodged against the skirting. The fragment, once white but now bearing the grainy patina of a room that collected whispers, showed traces of gilding along one edge and the remains of ornate lettering. "Hound." "From Dr. Hale's tin of lozenges," Alleyn observed, recalling young Mary's testimony about the green container with gold letters. The fragment represented more than casual litter. It spoke to nervous handling, perhaps the unconscious friction of thumb against edge that had caused the label to nick loose under pressure. Mrs. Hartwell, who had accompanied them with the protective dignity that housekeepers bring to official inquiries, confirmed that no horehound pastilles were kept in the Echo Room's usual appointments. The tin, therefore, represented another deviation from established routine, another element introduced into the chamber's careful choreography. The butler's professional eye. Trevithick's observations proved particularly illuminating as he restored the room's arrangements with unconscious precision. His trained attention to household details revealed irregularities that would escape casual notice but registered with professional sensibilities as fundamentally disturbing. "The salver bears a streak in the dust at the upper left," he noted with the reluctant precision of one whose expertise compelled honesty despite discretion. "When I pour, I invariably rest the stopper at the upper right. Someone has handled the service with different habits." The observation carried implications that extended beyond mere clumsiness. "Someone is left-handed," the butler concluded with quiet certainty, then immediately coloured as if he had violated some unspoken rule of domestic neutrality. "Not at all," Alleyn assured him gently. "A house's business is indeed to know which way its people turn." The glove's revelation. The discovery of Miss Vance's missing glove proved particularly significant. Trevithick produced it from his inner pocket with the careful ceremony reserved for delicate evidence, laying it upon the chest with protective precision. The biscuit-coloured kid bore a dark crescent along the inner seam of the index finger, a stain that had penetrated the leather and left it stiff with something more complex than mere ink. "I found it on the landing by the east stairs," Trevithick explained with obvious reluctance, "after the evening's complications." When Miss Vance was questioned about her gloves, her responses carried that careful precision that marked someone choosing words with particular attention to their implications. She had removed only one glove during the performance, a violation of her established superstition that suggested practical necessity, rather than thoughtless habit. The water's secret. The crystal carafe that had provided refreshment during the evening's rehearsal revealed its own story under careful examination. The water within appeared perfectly clear and innocent, yet the vessel's interior showed the faintest trace of residue near the lip, a film so subtle it was visible only when light struck it at precisely the correct angle. Alleyn lifted the carafe with gloved hands, noting how the crystal stopper refused to seat properly in the silver neck, creating an imperfect seal that would alter the water's exposure to air and potentially to other influences. The missing silver stopper, with its perfect fit and different chemical properties, represented more than mere domestic inconvenience. It suggested deliberate substitution for purposes that transcended household routine. The pattern emerging. As the examination concluded, Alleyn found himself contemplating the careful orchestration that would have been required to introduce so many subtle alterations into Wintermere's established routines. The displaced brass scales, the substituted stopper, the acoustic experiments, the botanical research, the modified fountain pen with its stained nib. Each element appeared innocent in isolation, yet together they suggested preparation that extended far beyond amateur theatrical requirements. The Echo Room's acoustic properties, which had seemed merely atmospheric during the evening's performance, now revealed their potential as something more purposeful. The chamber's ability to amplify and distribute sound might serve other functions as well, particularly for someone with sophisticated understanding of both medieval architecture and modern medical knowledge. Dr. Hale's research into the house's botanical history, his nervous handling of the lozenge tin, his specific request for fresh water, and his obvious agitation during the performance. These details acquired new significance when viewed through the lens of systematic preparation rather than casual eccentricity. The quiet accumulation. Yet Alleyn maintained his characteristic restraint in drawing conclusions. The evidence suggested complexity and deliberation, but the full pattern remained tantalizingly beyond complete understanding. Who among the evening's company possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to orchestrate such elaborate deceptions? What motive could justify such extreme measures? And most puzzling of all, what role had Dr. Hale himself played in the evening's tragic conclusion? The Echo Room maintained its secrets with the patience of centuries, its acoustic properties continuing to transform whispers into something approaching revelation. Yet as Alleyn prepared to leave the chamber, he recognized that the investigation had moved beyond simple inquiry into something approaching archaeological excavation, the careful unearthing of buried motives and hidden connections that had found their expression in this ancient space designed to amplify every sound into truth. The storm continued its assault on the narrow windows, but within the chamber, a different kind of tempest was building, one composed of accumulated evidence, disrupted routines, and the gradual recognition that the evening's amateur theatricals had provided cover for activities far more serious than Shakespeare's exploration of justice and mercy. The quality of truth, unlike mercy, was proving to be very much strained indeed, compressed by the weight of secrets that even the Echo Room's amplifying properties had not yet succeeded in releasing into the light. As they prepared to return to the drawing room, Alleyn reflected that houses, like people, reveal their deepest secrets not through dramatic confession, but through the subtle betrayal of established habits. Windermere had begun to tell its story through displaced objects, altered routines, and the accumulation of small deviations that, when properly understood, might yet illuminate the darkness that had settled over the Echo Room's ancient stones. The morning brought no relief from the storm's persistence, though its violence had settled into that steady grey assault that marks winter's deepest grip. Windermere House seemed to contract around its inhabitants, the corridors appearing narrower, the rooms more intimate, as if the building itself were drawing its occupants closer together for purposes that transcended mere shelter. In the drawing room, breakfast had been arranged with Trevithick's customary precision, yet the silver gleamed with a cold light that seemed to mock the pretense of normal domestic routine. The inventory of absence. Inspector Alleyn moved through the house with that quiet purposefulness that had characterized his investigation from its beginning, yet something in his manner suggested that the night's passage had brought revelations that extended beyond mere accumulation of evidence. Mrs. Hartwell accompanied him to Dr. Hale's quarters, where the absence of the physician's leather notebook had acquired the weight of deliberate concealment rather than casual mislaying. "The book was here when I brought the evening water," she confirmed, with that precision that made superior housekeepers invaluable to investigations, lying open on the blotter with those botanical sketches visible. This morning, nothing, not even the impression on the desk pad where it had rested. The window stood fractionally open to the storm's breath, and on the sill a delicate scatter of herb fragments had collected, rosemary needles and something finer with that elusive bitter fragrance Alleyn had detected in the Echo Room. In the small fireplace beneath the grate's iron bars lay the ghostly remains of burned paper, too thoroughly destroyed to yield text but retaining enough substance to suggest systematic destruction rather than casual disposal. Sergeant Fox, who had been conducting his methodical examination of the room's periphery, crouched near the writing desk and produced a small fragment of what appeared to be a gummed label. The corner bore traces of gold stamping, an ornate letter that might have been A, followed by a flourish that suggested apothecary's precision rather than amateur penmanship. "Professional labelling," Alleyn observed, noting how the fragment's edges showed signs of careful removal rather than accidental tearing. Dr. Hale was not merely researching historical treatments, he was implementing them. The medical consultation revealed. The return to the drawing room found the company arranged in attitudes that suggested careful consideration of their positions, both physical and psychological. Mr. Giles Ashworth occupied a chair near the fire with movements that betrayed nervous energy, beneath cultivated calm, while Miss Vance had positioned herself where morning light from the tall windows would illuminate without flattering, a choice that spoke to professional understanding of how illumination reveals or conceals. "Mr. Ashworth," Alleyn began with that gentle courtesy that marked his approach to human complexity, "I believe the time has come to discuss more fully the nature of your consultations with Dr. Hale. The evidence suggests they extended beyond routine medical examination." Ashworth's composure flickered with the precision of a candle flame encountering draught. "The matter was delicate, Inspector. My father died at 35 of what the physicians termed nervous exhaustion, though the symptoms suggested something more specific. Dr. Hale believed he had identified the underlying condition, a hereditary weakness that might be addressed through preventive treatment." "What sort of treatment?" "Historical methods that modern medicine had abandoned, perhaps prematurely. Dr. Hale had researched medieval approaches to conditions affecting the nervous system, treatments that required specific environmental conditions and precise dosages of botanical preparations." Ashworth's voice carried the careful modulation of one who had rehearsed this explanation, yet found it inadequate to the moment's demands. The revelation settled into the room's atmosphere with uncomfortable weight. Captain Thornton, whose military bearing had remained intact despite the evening's disruptions, shifted with movements that suggested professional assessment of a situation requiring tactical consideration. The scholar's departure. Mr. Julian Carstairs, who had maintained his position near the library throughout the morning's discussions, approached with that mild expression of academic interest that had characterised his presence since his arrival at Windermere. Yet something in his manner suggested that scholarly detachment had been replaced by more urgent considerations. "Inspector," he said with careful precision, "I find myself obliged to return to London earlier than planned. My research has reached a natural conclusion, and pressing matters require my attention in town." The announcement carried implications that extended beyond casual change of plans. Alleyn noted how Carstairs' leather-bound notebook, which had been a constant companion throughout his stay, was conspicuously absent from his person, and his usual academic paraphernalia had been reduced to a single small valise that suggested hasty rather than methodical packing. "The storm makes travel inadvisable," Lady Constance observed with that gentle authority that had sustained 3 generations of Windermeres through social complexities. "Nevertheless," Carstairs replied with quiet firmness, "I believe departure would be prudent." The exchange possessed undertones that spoke to knowledge carefully withheld and decisions made under pressure that transcended mere convenience. Alleyn allowed the moment to settle before responding with characteristic courtesy. "I'm afraid that won't be possible just yet, Mr. Carstairs. The investigation requires that all members of last evening's company remain available for further consultation." The botanical evidence. Trevithick's appearance with the morning's correspondence provided opportunity for quiet revelation that maintained the investigation's understated character. Among the letters lay a small envelope bearing Dr. Hale's precise handwriting, addressed to himself and marked "Private Research, Medieval Botanical Applications." The envelope's contents proved illuminating. Pressed specimens of herbs from Windermere's neglected garden, each labelled with Latin nomenclature, and accompanied by notes detailing historical applications and modern dosage calculations. Among the specimens, aconite and digitalis appeared with particular frequency, their notation suggesting systematic experimentation rather than casual botanical interest. "The herb garden," Alleyn observed, "appears to have served purposes that extended beyond ornamental cultivation. Dr. Hale's research suggests he had identified specific plantings that could provide materials for his historical treatments. Mrs. Hartwell, whose knowledge of household management included intimate familiarity with Windermere's grounds, confirmed that Dr. Hale had spent considerable time in the garden during previous visits, collecting specimens and making detailed notes about their cultivation and preparation. The pattern of preparation. As morning progressed toward afternoon, the accumulation of evidence began to reveal a pattern of systematic preparation that cast the previous evening's performance in an entirely different light. The missing silver stopper, the displaced botanical specimens, the acoustic experiments in the echo room, the careful modification of established household routines. These elements suggested orchestration that extended far beyond amateur theatrical requirements. Yet questions remained that challenged simple explanations. The fountain pen found near Dr. Hale's body bore traces of ink that matched the stain on Ashworth's thumb, suggesting interactions that had not been acknowledged in their testimonies. Miss Vance's missing glove had been discovered in a location that implied movement through the house during the evening's performance. The brass scales from the still room had been positioned in the echo room with mathematical precision that spoke to purposes transcending mere theatrical props. The quiet accumulation of pressure. The investigation's progress had begun to affect the household's carefully maintained equilibrium in ways that transcended mere inconvenience. Lady Constance's composure, while still admirable, showed signs of strain in the slight tremor of her pearls and the way her gaze had begun to avoid direct contact with her guests. Captain Thornton's military bearing remained intact, yet his positioning near the windows suggested readiness for developments that might require tactical response. Miss Vance maintained her professional composure with that discipline that had served her through years of theatrical performance, yet something in her manner suggested awareness that the evening's drama was approaching its climactic movement. Her hands, bare of gloves since the previous evening's discovery, seemed almost defenceless in the morning light, and her occasional glances toward the echo room's direction carried weight that transcended casual curiosity. The servant's silent knowledge. The domestic staff's observations continued to provide texture to the investigation that the drawing-room's civilized discussions could not reveal. young Mary's testimony about Dr. Hale's specific request for fresh water and his reaction to the lozenges from his tin acquired new significance when considered alongside the botanical evidence and the modified water service in the echo room, Trevithick's discovery of displaced items throughout the house, a crystal stopper in the breakfast room, brass scales in an upstairs corridor, traces of soil on carpets that should have remained pristine, painted a picture of nocturnal activities that had disrupted Windermere's established routines in ways both subtle and systematic. The approaching resolution. As afternoon shadows began to gather despite the storm's persistent grey, Alleyn found himself contemplating not merely the accumulation of evidence, but the psychological pressures that had begun to fracture the careful social conventions that had sustained the household through the investigation's early stages. The quality of mercy might indeed be unstrained, but the quality of truth was proving to be under considerable compression, squeezed by the weight of secrets that even death had not succeeded in releasing. The echo room remained sealed, its acoustic properties holding whatever secrets the ancient stones had absorbed during the previous evening's performance. Yet the investigation had moved beyond that chamber's honey-coloured walls, into the broader architecture of human motive and opportunity, where the careful choreography of domestic routine had recorded activities that might yet prove crucial to understanding what had truly transpired in those medieval spaces designed to amplify every whisper into revelation. The storm continued its assault on Windermere's ancient stones, but within the house a different kind of tempest was building, one composed of accumulated evidence, disrupted routines, and the gradual recognition that the previous evening's amateur theatricals had provided cover for activities far more serious than Shakespeare's exploration of justice and mercy. The investigation had reached that delicate moment when hidden truths must either emerge into the light or retreat permanently into the shadows of civilized discretion, and Alleyn sensed that the resolution, when it came, would possess the same understated inevitability that had characterized the evening's tragic conclusion in the echo room's acoustic embrace. The afternoon brought a subtle shift in Windermere's atmosphere, as if the storm's persistent grey had finally settled into the house's ancient stones with the weight of accumulated secrets. Inspector Alleyn found himself drawn to the library, where the hushed presence of centuries seemed to offer sanctuary from the drawing-room's carefully maintained tensions. The air held that particular fragrance of old leather and binding glue, yet underneath lay something else, the faint, bitter residue of recent disturbance. The scholar's laboratory. Several volumes lay upon the central table with the casual precision of systematic consultation rather than idle browsing. Gerard's Herbal and Culpeper's English Physician stood open to pages marked with ruthless practicality, their margins bearing penciled notations in Dr. Hale's precise hand. An 18th-century treatise on medieval chapel architecture completed the collection, a paper knife thrust between its pages like an accusatory finger. Alleyn circled the table without touching its contents, noting how each book contributed to a curriculum that transcended casual scholarly interest. The paper knife bore traces of something more substantial than ink, a thin film that caught the grey light with reluctant sheen, identical to the residue he had observed on the echo room's carafe. Between the pages of Gerard's text, a pale dusting of crushed botanical material remained, bitter on the nose and green with that particular intensity that spoke to recent preparation rather than ancient preservation. The pattern was becoming clear with uncomfortable precision. Dr. Hale had not merely been researching historical treatments, he had been implementing them with the systematic thoroughness that marked his approach to all professional endeavours. The library had served as his laboratory, the echo room as his testing chamber, and the previous evening's performance as his carefully orchestrated experiment in applied psychology. The garden's testimony. The herb garden, viewed from the east corridor's window, revealed its own story written in the storm's softened earth. Bootprints crossed toward the echo room's window and returned by a different path, while lighter, narrower impressions suggested a second visitor whose movements had been more cautious, more considered. Among the neglected beds, wooden stakes had been disturbed, their leather bindings cut with surgical precision to harvest specimens that should have remained dormant until spring's proper season. Alleyn followed these traces with growing understanding of the preparation that had preceded the evening's tragedy. Someone had moved through Windermere's grounds with intimate knowledge of both the house's layout and the garden's botanical offerings, collecting materials that would serve purposes extending far beyond horticultural interest. The crushed remnant of aconite, its black blossom head shrunken with winter's grip, lay where it had been discarded after yielding its more potent essence. The acoustic revelation. Returning to the echo room with Sergeant Fox, Alleyn conducted experiments that would have appeared playful had they not been executed with such grave precision. The chamber's medieval acoustics revealed their full potential when properly understood. Whispers became conversation, secrets transformed into public declaration, and privacy dissolved into unwanted intimacy. A man standing in the herb garden could observe activities within the octagonal chamber while remaining invisible to its occupants, the window's position, and the room's acoustic properties creating opportunities for surveillance that transcended casual eavesdropping. Yet the room held another secret, more subtle but equally significant. The air near the window carried that peculiar quality Alleyn had noted previously, a film that seemed to resist breath, creating conditions where a man whose throat had grown unreasonably dry would find the temptation of refreshment impossible to resist. Here, in this carefully prepared environment, Dr. Hale's experiment had encountered resistance that transformed controlled psychological pressure into something far more dangerous. The pattern of preparation. The evidence accumulated throughout the investigation now revealed its full significance when viewed through the lens of systematic orchestration. The missing silver stopper replaced by ill-fitting crystal that would alter the carafe's seal. The brass scales transported from still room to echo room for precise measurement of botanical preparations. The fountain pen with its stained nib positioned across Shakespeare's prophetic words about poison and death. Each element appeared innocent in isolation, yet together they painted a portrait of meticulous preparation that extended far beyond amateur theatrical requirements. Dr. Hale's research had provided the framework, but someone else had supplied the execution. The physician's notebooks, now mysteriously absent, had contained more than botanical sketches. They had held the blueprint for psychological manipulation that could compel truth from those determined to conceal it. Yet the experiment had been turned against its creator with surgical precision, using his own methods and materials to silence the very voice that sought to amplify hidden guilt into public confession. The handwriting on the wall. The signatures Fox had collected with characteristic delicacy revealed their own story through the manner of their inscription rather than their content. Miss Vance's controlled rightward slant, Captain Thornton's military precision, Ashworth's schoolboy flourishes. Each reflected personality made manifest through pen and ink. Yet Mr. Carstairs' left-handed script, with its characteristic smudging and the telltale ridge of black upon his little finger, confirmed Trevithick's observation about the salver's displaced dust pattern with uncomfortable certainty. The fountain pen found near Dr. Hale's body acquired new significance in light of this revelation. Its position, its stained nib, its proximity to those prophetic words about poison. These details suggested not accident but deliberate placement, a signature of sorts left by someone whose habitual movements had been recorded in displaced dust and altered household routines. The psychological architecture. As afternoon progressed toward evening, Alleyn found himself contemplating not merely the accumulation of physical evidence, but the psychological pressures that had driven someone to such elaborate measures. Dr. Hale had understood that certain truths required specific conditions for their revelation, and he had created those conditions with the systematic thoroughness that marked his approach to all professional challenges. The echo room's acoustic properties, the botanical preparations, the careful manipulation of environmental factors, all had been designed to create psychological pressure that would make concealment impossible. Yet the physician had underestimated the desperation of someone whose secrets were worth killing to protect. His experiment in applied psychology had provided both opportunity and motive for actions that transcended the boundaries of civilized behavior, transforming controlled revelation into permanent silence. The approaching storm. The investigation had reached that critical moment where accumulated evidence must coalesce into understanding or fragment into irresolvable complexity. Each member of the company possessed both motive and opportunity, yet only one had demonstrated the knowledge, preparation, and desperate necessity required to orchestrate such elaborate deception. The quality of mercy might indeed be unstrained, but the quality of justice demanded conditions that transcended drawing-room civilities. As shadows gathered despite the storm's persistent grey, Alleyn prepared for the final movement of an investigation that had revealed the careful architecture of human deception and the terrible consequences that could result when psychological pressure encountered guilty knowledge in an environment designed to amplify every whisper into truth. The Echo Room awaited one final performance, and this time there would be no script to guide the players through their appointed roles. The house settled around them with that particular stillness that marks the approach of revelation, its ancient stones holding their accumulated secrets with the patience of centuries. Yet even medieval discretion had its limits, and Alleyn sensed that Windermere was finally prepared to surrender the truth it had harboured through the long hours since Dr. Hale's collapse in the chamber, designed to make concealment impossible. The storm continued its assault on the narrow windows, but within the house, a different kind of tempest was building, one that would require more than architectural ingenuity to resolve, demanding instead the careful application of justice to secrets that had found their expression in the Echo Room's acoustic embrace. The afternoon had settled into that peculiar stillness that precedes revelation, the storm's violence diminishing to a steady percussion against Windermere's ancient stones. Inspector Alleyn found himself drawn once more to the Echo Room, not for dramatic confrontation, but for that methodical clarification which marked his approach to human complexity. The chamber awaited them with the patient dignity of medieval architecture, its honey-coloured walls holding secrets with the discretion of centuries. The careful arrangement. Lady Constance led the procession with the measured dignity that had sustained 3 generations of Windermeres through social crises, though her pearls betrayed that slight tremor which spoke to nerves carefully controlled beneath cultivated calm. The company arranged themselves with unconscious precision in their familiar positions, Miss Vance at the chamber's acoustic centre, Captain Thornton maintaining his protective stance slightly behind and to the left, Mr. Ashworth within reach of the oak chest that had served as their makeshift stage. Mr. Carstairs chose his position near the narrow window, with that academic deliberation that had characterised his presence throughout the investigation, one hand resting against the stone wall with casual familiarity. Only now, in the grey light of approaching evening, did the gesture acquire significance that transcended scholarly interest in medieval acoustics. The room speaks, Alleyn observed with characteristic understatement, to those who understand its particular grammar. Mr. Carstairs demonstrated this phenomenon yesterday with considerable expertise. The scholar inclined his head with that mild courtesy which had marked all his interactions at Windermere. The medieval builders possessed remarkable sophistication in matters of sound and space, Inspector. Their understanding extended beyond mere architectural curiosity. The acoustic revelation. At Alleyn's gentle request, Carstairs repeated his demonstration, placing his lips near the stone and speaking in a voice scarcely louder than contemplation. "Interpretation depends upon perspective," he murmured, and the words travelled with that peculiar clarity the chamber bestowed upon whispers, reaching each listener as if spoken directly into their ear. Miss Vance started slightly, not at the words themselves, but at their familiarity. She had heard this phrase before during the previous afternoon's experiments, when the Echo Room's properties had been explored with what she had assumed was casual scholarly interest. Now, in the context of a systematic investigation, those innocent demonstrations acquired implications that transcended academic curiosity. Alleyn moved to the chamber's focal point and allowed a single word to fall into the acoustic space. Notebook. The syllable travelled according to some medieval calculus of stone and angle, reaching not the person who had spoken it, but the one it would most disturb. Carstairs' composure flickered, no more than the way a man glances toward a door when expecting an unwelcome visitor. The evidence accumulates. Sergeant Fox appeared with that perfect timing which distinguished superior police work, carrying items that had been collected throughout the investigation with methodical precision. The leather-bound notebook, recovered from Carstairs' hastily packed belongings, lay open to reveal Dr. Hale's meticulous research into botanical preparations and their historical applications. The pressed specimens, each labelled with Latin nomenclature and accompanied by dosage calculations, painted a portrait of systematic experimentation that transcended casual scholarly interest. Dr. Hale's research, Alleyn observed with gentle courtesy, reveals a fascinating intersection of medical knowledge and historical practice. The Echo Room's properties provided ideal conditions for his investigations into the psychological effects of environmental manipulation. The crystal carafe, with its ill-fitting stopper, stood upon the oak chest like evidence of domestic disruption elevated to criminal significance. Trevithick, whose professional discretion had been strained by the investigation's demands, confirmed that the proper silver stopper remained missing, its absence creating conditions that would alter the water's exposure to air and potentially to other influences. The botanical architecture. The afternoon's discoveries in the herb garden and still room now acquired their full significance when viewed through the lens of systematic preparation. Someone with intimate knowledge of both Wintermere's layout and historical botanical practices had been conducting experiments that extended far beyond Dr. Hale's documented research. The displaced items, the modified water, service, the careful positioning of brass scales transported from still room to echo room. Each element contributed to a portrait of orchestration that transcended amateur theatrical requirements. Medieval practitioners, Alleyn continued with that understated precision which marked his approach to complex evidence, understood that certain substances could be absorbed through skin contact or respiratory exposure. The echo room's peculiar dryness, which affects the throat and creates desire for refreshment, would provide ideal conditions for such applications. Miss Vance's missing glove, produced by Trevithick with protective ceremony, bore that dark crescent along the inner seam, which spoke to contact with something more complex than theatrical makeup. Her professional composure remained intact, yet something in her manner suggested awareness that the evening's drama was approaching its climactic movement. The psychological pressure. As shadows gathered despite the chamber's lamplight, Alleyn found himself contemplating not merely the accumulation of physical evidence, but the psychological architecture that had driven someone to such elaborate measures. Dr. Hale's systematic approach to extracting truth through environmental manipulation had provided both framework and opportunity for actions that transcended the boundaries of civilized behavior. Captain Thornton's military bearing showed signs of strain in the slight rigidity about his shoulders that suggested conscious effort to maintain composure. His positioning near the archway, which had seemed merely protective during the previous evening's performance, now appeared to serve purposes that extended beyond casual gallantry. Mr. Ashworth sat with movements that betrayed increasing nervous energy, the ink stain on his thumb having darkened throughout the day as if absorbing guilt along with the fountain pen's persistent residue. His consultations with Dr. Hale about hereditary conditions had apparently involved treatments that required discretion extending beyond normal medical confidentiality. The pattern emerging. The fountain pen found near Dr. Hale's body acquired new significance in light of the investigation's accumulated evidence. Its position across Shakespeare's prophetic words about poison and death, the stained nib that matched the mark on Ashworth's thumb, the deliberate placement that suggested signature rather than accident. These details painted a portrait of systematic preparation turned against its creator with surgical precision. The quality of mercy, Alleyn observed with quiet precision that seemed to expand in the chamber's acoustic embrace, may indeed be unstrained, as our playwright suggests. Yet the quality of justice requires conditions that transcend drawing-room civilities and amateur theatrical conventions. The Echo Room held its accumulated secrets with the patience of centuries, yet even medieval discretion had its limits. The investigation had reached that delicate moment where hidden truths must either emerge into the light or retreat permanently into the shadows of civilized convention. The approaching resolution. As evening settled over Wintermere House, with that particular stillness that marks the intersection of storm and calm, Alleyn prepared for the final movement of an investigation that had revealed the careful architecture of human deception. The Echo Room's acoustic properties, which had seemed merely atmospheric during the previous evening's performance, now stood revealed as something far more purposeful, a medieval confessional designed to make concealment impossible and privacy dissolve into unwanted revelation. Each member of the company possessed elements of motive and opportunity, yet only one had demonstrated the knowledge, preparation, and desperate necessity required to orchestrate such elaborate deception. The botanical evidence, the acoustic experiments, the systematic disruption of household routines, all pointed to someone whose understanding of both medieval architecture and modern medical practice had been employed in service of purposes that transcended scholarly curiosity. The storm continued its diminished assault on the narrow windows, but within the echo room, a different kind of tempest was building, one that would require more than architectural ingenuity to resolve. The investigation had moved beyond accumulation of evidence into that realm where truth and justice intersected with human necessity, demanding resolution that would satisfy both legal requirements and the deeper demands of moral order. As they prepared to leave the chamber for what Alleyn sensed would be the final time, as investigators rather than participants in concluded drama, he reflected that houses, like people, revealed their deepest secrets not through dramatic confession, but through the subtle betrayal of established habits. Windermere had begun to tell its story through displaced objects, altered routines, and the accumulation of small deviations that, when properly understood, illuminated the darkness that had settled over the echo room's ancient stones. The quality of truth, unlike mercy, was proving to be very much strained indeed, compressed by the weight of secrets that even the chamber's amplifying properties had not yet succeeded in releasing into the light. Yet Alleyn recognized that the moment of revelation approached with the same quiet inevitability that had characterized Dr. Hale's collapse in this space designed to make concealment impossible. The echo room awaited one final performance, and this time there would be no script to guide the players through their appointed roles in the drama that was approaching its inevitable conclusion. The library received them with that particular gravity which old rooms impose upon moments of revelation, its leather-bound volumes standing witness to the careful accumulation of evidence that had brought them to this point. Inspector Alleyn arranged himself at the long table where Dr. Hale's botanical researches lay open like a confession, written in scholarly marginalia, each annotation now acquiring significance that transcended mere academic curiosity. The architecture of deception. "We've been examining," Alleyn began with characteristic understatement, "the intersection of medieval architecture and modern psychological experimentation. Dr. Hale believed that certain truths could be extracted through environmental manipulation, the echo room's properties serving as a kind of acoustic confession chamber where concealment would become impossible." Lady Constance maintained her composed dignity, though something in her manner suggested that the social conventions which had sustained 3 generations of Windermeres were proving inadequate to the current circumstances. The assembled company arranged themselves with unconscious precision, each occupying positions that reflected their roles in the evening's carefully orchestrated drama. Sergeant Fox produced Dr. Hale's recovered notebook with that methodical precision which marked superior police work, its pages revealing systematic research into botanical preparations and their psychological applications. The press specimens, each labelled with Latin nomenclature and accompanied by dosage calculations, painted a portrait of experimentation that extended far beyond casual scholarly interest. The fountain pen found near Dr. Hale's body, Alleyn observed, lifting the instrument with gloved hands, tells its own story through placement and circumstance. Its position across Shakespeare's prophetic words about poison, the stained nib that bears traces of something more complex than ink. These details suggest deliberate arrangement rather than accident. The scholar's true identity. Mr. Julian Carstairs, who had maintained his position near the narrow window throughout the investigation, moved with that academic deliberation which had characterized his presence at Windermere. Yet something in his manner suggested that scholarly detachment was yielding to more urgent considerations, as the accumulated evidence began to coalesce into understanding. "The left-handed evidence," Alleyn continued with gentle precision, "has been accumulating throughout our investigation. The salver's dust pattern, disturbed on the left where Trevithick invariably places items on the right, the fountain pen's positioning, the smeared marginalia in botanical texts, all point to someone whose natural movements had been recorded in displaced household routines." Carstairs' composure remained intact, yet his hands betrayed that slight tremor which spoke to nerves carefully controlled beneath cultivated calm. The leather-bound notebook that had been his constant companion lay conspicuously absent, its contents now part of the investigation's systematic reconstruction of events. "Your credentials, Mr. Carstairs, while impressive, prove upon examination to be somewhat incomplete. The research into Elizabethan staging techniques provided excellent cover for investigations of a more personal nature. Alleyn's voice carried that particular blend of courtesy and authority which marked his approach to complex human situations. St. Cyprian's Hospital retains vivid memories of a promising medical student whose experiments with pharmaceutical preparations were deemed inadvisable. The departure was quiet, the subsequent transformation into medieval scholar both thorough and convincing. The method revealed. The revelation settled into the library's atmosphere with the weight of accumulated understanding, each detail observed during the investigation now acquiring its proper significance in the larger pattern of human motive and opportunity. Dr. Hale's systematic approach to psychological manipulation had provided both framework and vulnerability for someone with intimate knowledge of his methods. The Echo Room's properties, Alleyn explained with characteristic restraint, created ideal conditions for Dr. Hale's experiment in environmental psychology. The chamber's peculiar dryness, its acoustic amplification, the careful positioning of refreshments, all designed to create pressure that would make concealment impossible. He gestured toward the botanical specimens arranged with scientific precision upon the table. Yet someone with superior knowledge of both medieval practices and modern pharmaceutical applications had been conducting parallel research. The missing silver stopper, replaced by ill-fitting crystal that would alter the water's exposure to air. The brass scales transported from still room to echo room for precise measurement of botanical preparations. Carstairs inclined his head, with that mild courtesy which had marked all his interactions at Windermere, though something in the gesture suggested acknowledgement of professional recognition rather than social pleasantry. The psychological architecture. Dr. Hale's notebook details his intentions with uncomfortable precision, Alleyn continued, turning pages that revealed the physician's systematic approach to extracting confession through environmental manipulation. He had identified what he believed to be deceptions among his patients, secrets that conventional medical consultation could not reveal. Mr. Ashworth shifted with movements that betrayed the intersection of guilt and relief, his conventional handsomeness appearing somehow diminished, as the full implications of his consultations with Dr. Hale became apparent. The ink stain on his thumb, which had darkened throughout the investigation, now seemed to pulse with accusatory significance. The hereditary condition you described, Mr. Ashworth, provided Dr. Hale with opportunity to observe symptoms that suggested psychological rather than physical distress. He intended to use the Echo Room's properties to compel acknowledgement of truths you had sought to conceal. The admission hung in the air with uncomfortable precision, yet Alleyn's manner suggested that individual guilt was merely one element in a larger pattern of systematic deception that had culminated in the Echo Room's acoustic embrace. The quiet confession. Carstairs moved toward the fireplace with that measured dignity which had characterized his scholarly presence throughout his stay at Windermere. His positioning near the mantel seemed to provide psychological support for revelations that transcended mere academic discussion. Dr. Hale recognized me, he said, with quiet precision that seemed to expand in the library's attentive silence. Not immediately, but with that professional memory that physicians possess for faces encountered in medical contexts. He did not expose me directly. That would have been crude, unworthy of his psychological sophistication. The scholar's voice carried that academic detachment which had marked all his contributions to household discussions, yet something in his tone suggested that intellectual analysis was yielding to more personal considerations. Instead, he proposed collaboration. His research required someone with intimate knowledge of medieval practices, and my previous experience provided qualifications that transcended conventional scholarship. He believed I would assist in his experiment in environmental psychology. Lady Constance's pearls betrayed that subtle tremor which spoke to nerves carefully controlled beneath cultivated surface, while Miss Vance maintained her professional composure with discipline that had served her through years of theatrical performance. The final movement. The botanical preparations, Carstairs continued with that precision which had distinguished his academic contributions throughout his stay, required modification to serve purposes Dr. Hale had not anticipated. His lozenges, designed to create psychological pressure through mild pharmaceutical influence, were enhanced to produce effects that would transcend mere discomfort. The revelation carried implications that settled into the library's atmosphere with the weight of systematic preparation turned against its creator. Dr. Hale's own methods, his careful environmental manipulation, his botanical researches, All had provided both opportunity and means for actions that transcended the boundaries of civilized behavior. The Echo Room's acoustic properties ensured that his final moments would be observed from the herb garden below. Medieval architects understood that confession required witnesses, even when those witnesses remained invisible to the penitent. Alleyn rose with fluid grace that suggested the investigation's methodical progression toward its inevitable conclusion. The quality of mercy might indeed be unstrained, as Shakespeare had suggested, but the quality of justice required conditions that transcended drawing-room civilities and academic discourse. There are, he observed with characteristic understatement, certain necessities that arise when professional reputation intersects with desperate circumstance. The transformation from medical student to medieval scholar represented considerable investment in reinvention, investment that Dr. Hale's recognition threatened to destroy. The library held its accumulated secrets with the patience of centuries, yet even scholarly discretion had its limits when confronted with evidence that demanded acknowledgement. As Sergeant Fox moved with his habitual gentleness toward a position that would become, if needed, escort rather than custody, the investigation approached that delicate moment where civilized convention must yield to the requirements of justice. The storm continued its diminished assault on Wintermere's ancient stones, but within the library, a different kind of tempest had reached its resolution, one composed of accumulated evidence, scholarly deception, and the careful application of medieval knowledge to modern psychological manipulation. The Echo Room's final performance had concluded, and this time there would be no applause to mark the end of a drama that had revealed the intersection of intellectual pride with human desperation in ways that even Shakespeare's exploration of justice and mercy had not anticipated. The confession, when it came, possessed that quiet dignity which distinguished scholarly discourse from theatrical melodrama. Mr. Julian Carstairs remained at the fireplace with the composed bearing of one, delivering a carefully prepared academic paper, though the subject matter transcended any curriculum that respectable universities might acknowledge. His transformation from medieval scholar to confessed killer required no dramatic gestures, merely the systematic application of intellectual honesty to circumstances that had moved beyond scholarly abstraction. The academic method. Dr. Hale's recognition was gradual but inevitable. Carstairs began with that precision, which had marked all his contributions to household discussions. He possessed that particular memory physicians develop for faces encountered in professional contexts, and my reinvention, however thorough, could not entirely erase the features of the medical student who had departed St. Cyprian's under irregular circumstances. Lady Constance maintained her dignified composure, though her pearls betrayed that subtle tremor which spoke to nerves carefully controlled beneath cultivated surface. The assembled company listened with that careful attention one accords to revelations that transcend ordinary domestic crisis, yet Carstairs' academic vocabulary served to distance the emotional implications, transforming murder into a problem requiring systematic solution. His initial approach was indirect, scholarly questions about medieval pharmaceutical practices that gradually became more specific, more personal. He understood that direct confrontation would be crude, unworthy of the psychological sophistication he brought to all professional encounters. Carstairs paused, his left hand resting against the mantel with steady composure that spoke to relief rather than distress. He proposed genuine collaboration. His research into environmental psychology required someone with intimate knowledge of medieval practices, and my previous experience provided qualifications that conventional scholarship could not supply. The botanical architecture. Alleyn observed how the revelation cast Dr. Hale's systematic preparation in an entirely different light. The botanical specimens, the acoustic experiments, the careful modification of household routines, all had been conducted with Carstairs' assistance, the physician believing he had found an ally in his investigation of psychological pressure and environmental manipulation. The Echo Room's properties fascinated him professionally, Carstairs continued with that mild courtesy, which had characterized his presence throughout the investigation. He understood that medieval architects had created spaces designed to extract confession through acoustic pressure, chambers where privacy dissolved and concealment became impossible. His intention was to use these properties to compel acknowledgement from those whose secrets conventional consultation could not reveal. Miss Vance's professional composure remained intact. yet something in her manner suggested awareness that the evening's drama had moved beyond theatrical convention into realms where performance and reality intersected with uncomfortable precision. Captain Thornton's military bearing showed signs of strain as the full implications of the orchestration became apparent. The botanical preparations required modification to serve purposes Dr. Hale had not anticipated, Carstairs explained with academic detachment that transformed pharmaceutical murder into scholarly problem-solving. His lozenges, designed to create mild psychological pressure through herbal influence, were enhanced with substances that would produce effects transcending mere discomfort. The silver stopper's replacement with ill-fitting crystal created conditions where the water's exposure to air would facilitate absorption of substances applied to the vessel's interior surfaces. The experiment reversed. The fountain pen found near Dr. Hale's body acquired its full significance in light of this revelation. Its stained nib bore traces not of ink, but of concentrated botanical preparations that had been applied to the physician's refreshments with surgical precision. The deliberate positioning across Shakespeare's prophetic words about poison represented not accident but signature. The scholar's need to acknowledge intellectual authorship, even in circumstances requiring absolute discretion. The experiment was intended to expose Mr. Ashworth's deceptions regarding his consultations, Carstairs explained with that academic clarity which transformed personal crisis into case study. Dr. Hale suspected that the hereditary condition described was fabrication, designed to conceal difficulties of a different nature entirely. My own situation was considerably more desperate. The transformation from medical student to medieval scholar represented years of careful reinvention that his recognition threatened to destroy. Mr. Ashworth's composure, which had been deteriorating throughout the investigation, finally yielded to acknowledgement that transcended mere embarrassment. The matter was indeed delicate, he admitted, with movements that betrayed the intersection of guilt and relief. Financial irregularities that required medical consultation as cover for meetings that could not be acknowledged publicly. The quiet resolution. As the confession concluded, Sergeant Fox moved with his characteristic gentleness, approaching Carstairs with the discretion that marked superior police work. There was no struggle, no desperate resistance, merely the scholar's precise extension of his wrists as if participating in a formal academic ceremony. The enhancement of the botanical preparations was conducted with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all our collaborative research, Carstairs observed with final precision. The Echo Room's properties ensured that the experiment's conclusion would be observed from the herb garden below. Medieval architects understood that confession required witnesses, even when those witnesses remained invisible to the penitent. Trevithick appeared with that perfect timing which distinguished superior domestic service, carrying Carstairs' overcoat and umbrella as if preparing for perfectly ordinary departure. He assisted with the coat with movements that betrayed no judgment, only the unwavering professionalism that had sustained 3 generations of Wintermeres through social complexities. The restoration of order. As the small procession departed into the storm's persistent grey, the library settled into that particular stillness which follows revelation. Lady Constance, practicality prevailing over shock, rose and rang for tea with movements that declared Wintermere's intention to survive this disruption as it had survived others. "Mrs. Whitmore will not return tonight," she observed to no one in particular. "The vicarage will keep its own counsel." Captain Thornton crossed to Ashworth with military efficiency. "There's a decent doctor in Little Darnford who will not bully you. I'll run you over when the roads permit." Miss Vance moved to the window, gazing out where the herb garden lay like a map with its details covered by snow. "Theatricals," she said with trace of self-mockery. "We are told they're rehearsal for life. It is never mentioned that life may be rehearsal for theatricals." When tea arrived, it behaved itself with proper ceremony. Trevithick set a small plate upon the table, and withdrew. It held the silver stopper, newly polished, catching lamplight and returning it without distortion. The thing had been restored to its rightful place, completing the careful process of putting Wintermere's disrupted routines back into their proper order. "Very pretty," Lady Constance said, and this time her pearls were steady. "Tomorrow we shall tell Mrs. Whitmore that Shakespeare can wait upon Easter. Wintermere has had enough of justice for one season." The storm continued its assault on the ancient stones, but within the house the tempest of human deception had reached its resolution. The Echo Room's final performance had concluded, and the quality of truth, unlike mercy, had proven to be very much strained indeed, compressed by the weight of secrets that even confession could not entirely release into the light. Yet justice had been served not with clamour, but with the quiet, methodical uncovering of truth, as understated and relentless as the winter storm that pressed against Wintermere's patient stones. Snow had come in the night and simplified the world. Wintermere's ancient stones, which had witnessed such complexity of human motive and deception, now wore winter's clean benediction with medieval patience. The herb garden lay beneath an unblemished coverlet that concealed the churned earth where desperate hands had gathered botanical specimens for purposes that transcended horticultural curiosity. In the pale morning light, the house seemed to exhale the accumulated tensions of the previous days, settling into that profound stillness which follows the resolution of long-held secrets. Inspector Alleyn stood at the drawing-room window contemplating not triumph, but the curious architecture of human desperation. Dr. Hale had constructed an elaborate psychological trap, believing that truth, like a medical condition, could be diagnosed and compelled through environmental manipulation. The Echo Room's medieval properties had been pressed into service as a confessional chamber where concealment would become impossible, yet the physician had underestimated the systematic thoroughness of a scholar whose carefully constructed identity faced complete destruction. Carstairs' transformation from disgraced medical student to respected medieval authority had required years of meticulous reinvention. When recognition threatened to unravel this scholarly persona, he had responded with the same methodical precision that characterized his academic work. The botanical preparations, the acoustic experiments, the careful modification of household routines, all had been turned against their creator with surgical elegance that transcended mere opportunism. The house's recovery. Trevithick appeared with that perfect timing which had sustained 3 generations of Wintermeres through social crises, carrying the restored silver stopper on its velvet cushion. The crystal substitute had been relegated to the breakfast room, where imperfect seals posed no threat to domestic tranquillity. His movements spoke to the profound resilience of established routine, the way great houses absorbed disruption and emerged with dignity and tact. The Echo Room's appointments have been returned to their customary arrangement, he reported with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Hartwell has removed all traces of irregular botanical activity from the still room, and the brass scales have resumed their proper position. Lady Constance presided over breakfast with the composed dignity that had carried her through the investigation's most challenging moments. Her pearls no longer trembled, and something in her manner declared Wintermere's intention to survive this disruption, as it had survived centuries of human complexity. "We shall replant the herb garden come spring," she announced with practical authority. "Lavender and thyme, perhaps rosemary for remembrance. The aconite and foxglove served purposes that transcended their medicinal properties. One prefers gardens that court sleep rather than defy it." Miss Vance occupied her customary chair near the windows, morning light illuminating features that seemed somehow refined by the previous evening's ordeal. Her professional composure remained intact, yet something in her manner suggested that the intersection of performance and reality had been permanently altered by their experience in the Echo Room's acoustic embrace. "The quality of mercy," she observed with characteristic irony, "proves more complex than our playwright suggested. Justice, however, requires conditions that transcend drawing-room civilities entirely." Captain Thornton consulted his pocket watch with movements that suggested readiness for departure and new beginnings. "I shall escort Mr. Ashworth to proper medical consultation in Little Darnford," he announced with military efficiency. "The roads are passable, and London can wait upon more pressing necessities." His glance toward Miss Vance carried implications that transcended mere courtesy, and her answering smile suggested that Wintermere's disruption might yet yield consequences more pleasant than tragic. The scholar's departure. Mr. Ashworth accepted this assistance with gratitude that spoke to genuine relief rather than social obligation. The ink stain had finally faded from his thumb, yet the psychological pressure Dr. Hale had intended to apply had achieved its purpose despite the physician's tragic end. Financial irregularities that had required elaborate concealment would now receive proper attention rather than amateur psychological manipulation. Dr. Hale's methods, he admitted with quiet precision, might have succeeded in compelling acknowledgement had they not encountered someone with superior knowledge of pharmaceutical applications. The irony is not lost upon me that truth emerged through tragedy rather than therapeutic intervention. Alleyn's final observations. As morning progressed towards departure, Alleyn found himself contemplating the curious intersection of intellectual pride and human desperation that had culminated in murder disguised as amateur theatricals. The Echo Room would resume its customary silence, its acoustic properties reduced once more to architectural curiosity rather than instrument of psychological manipulation. Yet something of the previous evening's drama would remain embedded in those honey-coloured stones, another layer of human complexity added to chambers that had witnessed centuries of confession and concealment. Sergeant Fox joined him with that comfortable silence which distinguished their professional partnership, carrying the last of the evidence that would transform domestic objects into legal testimony: the modified fountain pen, the botanical specimens, the crystal stopper that had facilitated pharmaceutical murder. Each would find its place in official records, their sinister purposes reduced to bureaucratic notation. Quite elaborate preparation, Fox observed with characteristic understatement, for what was supposed to be amateur theatricals. Indeed, Alleyn replied, watching snow settle upon the neglected herb garden where medieval plantings had served purposes extending far beyond ornamental cultivation. Carstairs understood that academic reputation once lost cannot be restored through conventional means. Desperate circumstances often produce the most methodical responses. The enduring echo. As their motorcar departed through Wintermere's ancient gates, Alleyn reflected that some performances, unlike theatrical productions, possessed consequences that extended far beyond their final curtain. Houses, like people, revealed their deepest secrets not through dramatic confession, but through the subtle betrayal of established habits. The displaced silver stopper, the modified botanical preparations, the systematic disruption of domestic routine, each element had contributed to a portrait of human deception that transcended the boundaries of civilized behaviour. The Echo Room's last drama had concluded, but its reverberations would continue long after the official records had been filed and criminal proceedings concluded. Justice possessed its own acoustic properties. Truth, once released into proper spaces, amplified itself until concealment became impossible. Yet resolution brought not triumph, but that quiet understanding which marked the intersection of human frailty with moral necessity. The storm had passed, leaving behind that particular clarity which follows revelation. In the distance, Wintermere's stones caught winterlight and held it, patient as always, ready to shelter new secrets and witness fresh complexities in the endless drama of human nature. The quality of mercy might indeed be unstrained, as Shakespeare had suggested, but the quality of truth had proven to be under considerable pressure indeed, compressed by the weight of secrets that even medieval acoustics required systematic investigation to release into the light. Behind them, the Echo Room stood empty and unoffended, its ancient stones holding silence like a promise that some mysteries, once solved, need never repeat themselves in quite the same way again.